this episode of Action Hour, I'm speaking with my colleague, WEAN's Executive Director, Marnie Jackson, about the existential difficulties of navigating this world as an environmental activist and advocate. Marnie has worked in the nonprofit sector since 2007, serving on the Whidbey Institute team for nearly a decade in communications and executive director roles, and working more recently with Showing Up for Racial Justice as a senior donor organizer. She has also worked as a teacher, farmer, journalist, and editor. Marnie has a bachelor's degree in English from Suffolk University and is a certified language of spaces coach. She helped found Solidarity Over Supremacy Whidbey, is an elected member and legislative representative of the South Whidbey School Board, and serves on the Whidbey Community Foundation's Affordable Housing Fund Advisory Committee. In addition to working and volunteering, Marnie loves hiking, motorcycling, gardening, reading, and spending time among plants and animals. She lives outside Langley with her youngest daughter, Robin, her partner, Tim, and their dogs, cats, and mules. I'm excited. I'm so glad we're doing this and that we're finally going to share with everybody conversations that you and I have all of the time.
Yes. Yeah. I so often wish that we just had a little bird on the windowsill, remembering and recording what we talk about, because so much of it is fun stuff that I wish we could share with others.
Yeah, well, this is a really good opportunity to do that. And I really appreciate that you're here. I have kind of a doozy of a first question. I know I didn't actually send you questions ahead of time, which I feel bad about, but also we kind of talked about allowing the conversation to evolve. And so let's see where we go with it and kind of what we talk about. So we're in a shifting landscape right now with the overturning of the Chevron decision by the Supreme Court, which directly impacts environmental regulation. We are on the verge of a presidential election in the aftermath of an assassination attempt on a candidate. There's a massive garbage patch, 620,000 square miles of garbage floating in the Pacific Ocean, twice the size of Texas. In the last 20 years, the globe has lost 16% of forest cover, according to Global Forest Watch. Over the past year, we've experienced the hottest year on record, the hottest ocean temperatures on record, and seemingly endless string of heat waves, droughts, floods, wildfires, and storms. And the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration reported in early June that carbon is accumulating in the atmosphere faster than ever, accelerating on a steep rise to levels far above any experienced in human existence. So with that, setting the stage for our conversation, how do you personally, emotionally, and intellectually manage this reality on a day-to-day basis?
Wow. Well, first of all, thanks for the rosy outlook. Luckily, I'm naturally an optimist. And I've also been raising children in a time of climate consequences. So my youngest daughter is 17, my others are 19 and 24. And we've been having conversations throughout their childhoods about, what is the future for planet Earth? What is the future for human life?
Yeah.
And the only comfort that I continually come back to is local collective care, local sustainability, local economies of mutual aid and interconnectedness with place and people. And so when I think about the scale of the chaos and the scope of the challenges that we have to address as a species, it can be overwhelming to think about how can I make change at the global scale? How can I make change at the national scale? But when I actually work with my neighbors to make change locally, to interrupt oppressive systems and to create nurturing ones, that's where I tend to feel both empowered and optimistic, because I get to see systems change rapidly, more rapidly than one might think they can, in the framework of collective local action.
I really love that. And I love you bringing it back to local communities, because I think the reason why I started the podcast with such a pessimistic view is because I think I really wanted to articulate the overwhelm that I think people feel when thinking about the environment as a whole and climate catastrophe, and just like the ways in which the media comes at us with the terror and the horror and the seemingly impossible, right? That like we have been given, or we believe, I think, that we shoulder the burden of the entire world when we come from that view, when in fact we are responsible for ourselves and for our participation and our action and our impact. And I think that fatalism around climate change, or fatalism around our political landscape, is coming from what David, I think, had said in his interview with me, the wrong end of the telescope. He also talks about community organizing, specifically around municipal composting systems, and how like really getting clear on a local level how we can manage our organic waste can have great impact, And so I think there's a lot to be said for the framework of really thinking locally. And obviously that's, the work that you and I are committed to doing together with the WIDBE Environmental Action Network. And so, I'm curious, like when preparing for this conversation for our community of listeners and our listeners who are in our community, what is it that you want to share in this moment, Yeah,
thank you for that question. Well, when I think about local action, and when I think about how it's possible to be an agent for positive change, I also try to steer clear of the temptation of bypassing the global impact of living in an industrialized society. Living in a society that practices imperialism, living in a society that leverages my taxpayer dollars to commit acts of violence and ecocide. And there are factors playing out beyond Whidbey and Camino Islands that my labor contributes to through taxpayer dollars, through consumer behavior, through purchasing, through the corporations that I choose to do business with. And so when I thought about doing this podcast with you and having this conversation, I really started to reflect on that question around consumer behavior and individual responsibility, and then corporate and government behavior and responsibility, and how I think that so often corporations kind of greenwash their messaging and put out a social media or a PR campaign that's designed to make consumers feel like they have to be morally pure and self-sacrificing in order to cause the world to be better. And meanwhile, those corporations may very well keep doing very dirty things, but by giving the consumer what they perceive as a greener choice, a greener consumer choice, a greener purchasing choice, they're basically telling the consumer, keep giving us your money, keep being a good capitalist, keep turning your labor into disposable products, but do it in a way that makes you feel good. And that bypasses any responsibility for the corporation to do better. Just as an example, I don't like single-use straws. I would generally decline one if offered, but I don't personally have a really strong boundary around personal use, single-use disposable straws. And I remember for a while they were really trending as this corporate responsibility demand. Please stop producing single-use disposable plastic straws because they're polluting our oceans. And you mentioned the giant Pacific garbage patch. My understanding from a scientific report article that was shared by the Ocean Conservancy was that garbage patch is about 50% fishing waste. So the material that's used by the fishing industry, which gets discarded intentionally or accidentally, is contributing hugely to decimation of other species, non-target species, contributing hugely to fish die-off and contributing hugely to this accumulation of plastic garbage. Mm-hmm. But when you tell a consumer, you have a choice between saying no to a plastic disposable straw or changing the choices you make around how you eat and how you feed your family, it's easier for a corporation to say, make a product switch rather than make a lifestyle switch. And so I hope that people will be thoughtful about eating locally when they can, shopping locally when they can, bringing their dollars home to invest in the kinds of behaviors, activities, and economies that actually feed life.
I think I'm really glad that you brought up the consumer responsibility versus industry responsibility and put it in that framework, and really called out the ways in which companies use branding and kind of eco branding to package products in a way that doesn't really change the system of those products. And I think a lot of, the change that we all need to do as a society is systemic change. And there's a real tension and kind of paradox around that. Like, I know that, you and I are both like professional environmental advocates, and yet, have I been able to completely stop using Amazon for everything that I need in my life? Like the answer is no. I don't have an Amazon Prime account. I don't use Amazon. I use it as little as possible. But like, I'm not in a position to be able to completely have control over that. And I think that you're the like, being able to eat locally when you can, yes. Shop locally when you can, yes. But you and I have also talked about, like, we live on an island. There's something you can't get locally. And when in that circumstance, you're kind of put into like this conundrum of having to make an unethical choice.
Right. And it also, I think, really points to the economic inequity around access to shopping locally, access to making more environmentally sustainable choices as consumers, because so often people who want access to organic food have to drive further to get it, or people who want access to organic food have to live in a community where land is more expensive, or where there isn't the infrastructure to take public transportation to a market. I think we have really great food access on Whidbey Island because we have an extraordinary local food bank where food is free and available to all and supplemented by a really great on-site organic garden. But nationally, there are food deserts where people live in urban environments with no access to fresh produce. And so I just think even the privilege of being able to choose, a handmade garment that's sustainably traded and manufactured with organic cotton, I might be talking about an $18 or $20 uptick just to buy a t-shirt if I want to make those kinds of consumer choices. And so, if I'm shopping for my family on a budget and I'm choosing between the $8 t-shirt from the big box store or the $38 t-shirt that's, sustainably made and benefits a local entrepreneur, I may be forced into the choice that doesn't align with my values. And so to have compassion for one another around making our way through a morally ambiguous landscape in a society that tends to incentivize behaviors that benefit corporations over people, corporations over ecosystems. I think we need to hold each other with some grace around we make our way as best we can, and we center our values where we can, but compromise is inevitable.
Yeah, I think I feel that very acutely in really every consumer decision that I make in my life, that there's that I have to really be mindful of when like paralysis kicks in terms of like, oh, wow, I like don't have a good option. There's no good choice. There's no good option maybe in this moment. Or like you said, I'm not in a financial position to make that choice. I think the intersection of, race and class in environmental issues is a huge one, and one that, like, the concept of environmental justice is not new, but in terms of really framing our work and the work of our communities to understand that intersectionality, I think is critical to creating solutions that really have the outcome that's intended. On WIDB, we are really thinking about a lot of different issues, and in a kind of cycle of compromise with the comprehensive planning process as it relates to the dictation of the Growth Management Act and planning for population growth. And a big point of contention and exploration and an opportunity is around affordable housing. Like, what does that look like in our community, and how, and what is the best kind of, like, how can we design our way into good choices? There was a, what do you call it? A planning commission meeting last night about accessory dwelling units that I attended. And, it was just very interesting. Like they're talking on such a small scale, like, the number of units. It was like, right now there's currently like 35 ADU permits per year in certain areas in the county. And they're like, oh, well, maybe we double it and we make it affordable housing. But the commission had different ideas about what constitutes affordable housing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I recently joined a committee, the Would Be Affordable Housing Fund Advisory Committee, which is formulated to design a funding program and make funding decisions for the Would Be Community Foundation's Affordable Housing Fund. And I'm really excited about being involved in that work because housing is a human right and a real pressing need. And if Whidbey and Camino Islands are out of reach for people who want to experience living in these counties but have an economic barrier to doing so, then we're basically just protecting privilege, not protecting community, not protecting all of us. And for a long time, there's been, in our community and elsewhere, I imagine, there's been this false dichotomy that we're choosing between environmental protection or affordable housing. And really, the best housing solutions come with the least environmental damage, because when you put housing in a critical area, like adjacent to a wetland or on a steep slope or in a mature forest or in any of a number of places where it would be a mistake to put housing, you end up with humans living in conditions that are less suitable. Yeah. So you end up with people who are dealing with lots that don't perk, where it's impossible to put in a septic system because of groundwater. You end up with people who can't access public transportation or are really far from services, far from doctors and schools and grocery stores. And so there are a number of reasons that the places that are suitable to be developed have been developed, and the places that are less suitable to be developed really aren't ideal for more homes. And so when we say that the most responsible way to grow is outlined in the Growth Management Act is about increasing rural density, that's not because we selfishly want to keep the rural area for those who can afford it. It's because we recognize that all of society depends upon the ecosystem functions and the agricultural production that is made possible by protection of the rural area so that society can function. And if you end up with a city that is not supported by the ecosystems that feed the aquifer, the farmland that feeds the population, the forests that provide cooling and provide habitat and promote biodiversity, if you end up harming those systems to allow sprawl to create some housing where otherwise it wouldn't fit, you end up with a less stable society with fewer of its needs met, with more health risks. And those health risks tend to be disproportionately borne by the people with the least access to economic justice. So people who are experiencing the outcome of generations of racialized systemic oppression, people for whom generational wealth was not accumulated because of our nation's history of enslavement and land theft. People, I'm a white woman, and generally people of my racialized identity, people who look like me, have more generational wealth because of the way that society advantaged us and continues to advantage us today through systemic racism and the biases that are baked into our systems and structures. And so when we talk about protecting the rural areas, that is a justice issue. That is for everyone, because every single person in our society, regardless of race, regardless of class, regardless of age or ability or gender or identity, should be able to go into a healthy forest and should be able to drink clean water and should be able to breathe fresh air and eat healthy food grown in clean soil. And when we jeopardize that by advantaging development that increases sprawl over development that is thoughtful infill in places served by systems and services that people need in order to thrive, we just end up with a society that's less healthy for the people who can't afford to buy their way out of it into a rural area.
How, from your point of view on a local level, how do we go about the process of creating the access that we need to increase equity societally and environmentally?
That's a great question. Well, I feel like there's this myth that people who live amidst natural beauty want to hoard that natural beauty for themselves and let everybody else deal with the outfall. And really, I would say the perspective is we all deserve natural beauty and we all deserve the safety and health that comes from proximity to nature. So I want not more environmental conservation for me and less for my neighbors, but more for me and more for my neighbors, which I think can be compatible with development when development is done thoughtfully. Yeah. And so just as an example, I had a meeting last week with one of the city council members from Oak Harbor, and he and I chatted a bit about his vision for Oak Harbor's future and my vision for Oak Harbor's future. And we were in agreement about some points, including that the people of Oak Harbor, which is an urban growth area, deserve access to green spaces. Yes. They deserve the health and the beauty and the enrichment that comes from being able to see trees and birds and walk in a park. And we talked about, wouldn't it be nice if developers could be attracted to Oak Harbor to create spaces where people live amidst natural beauty, where buildings can be inclusive of green spaces and landscaped courtyards. And I've seen some incredible condo complexes in other cities where there's food forests right within the courtyard for residents so that they can go outside and eat an apple off a tree. And so when I think about urban infill development, I don't think about just cramming more people into a concrete jungle. I think about building really rich, biodiverse pockets of beautiful homes balanced with nature and habitat in the city. So we can look at green roofs, we can look at green verges, we can look at pocket parks in every neighborhood. There are some urban areas like Boston, where I went to college, where there are really large, beautiful natural areas. They call it the Emerald Necklace in the Boston area, but it's a series of parks that surrounds the urban area where you can get to something that feels wild within a short train ride. And so we need that and deserve that in every major city. And it's in addition to preserving the rural area, and it actually makes the city a more attractive place to live, which incentivizes developers to do that infill that is recommended by the Growth Management Act. And it's basically a win-win situation, because the more beautiful and healthy our cities can be, the more people are attracted to live in them, which then allows conservation and agricultural production to be the priority activities in the less developed places.
I think it's so much of what you're speaking to me is about quality of life and how ecosystem function promotes the quality of our lives, like everyone's life, whether you live in a rural area or an urban area. And in urban areas, in fact, the access to biodiversity and ecosystem function within that urban area increases quality of life. And as we deal with and contend with climate change, and people are dealing with heat domes and all of these things, there's the real, very concerning reality of the ways in which impervious surface and like concrete traps heat.
Absolutely.
And how and you know, it's you know, in some extreme cases it's fatal for people. It has been. And in cases where it's not, it's deeply uncomfortable. And then once again creates a situation where privilege is at play. Where do you have access to air conditioning? Can you pay for that service every month? Do you, you know, like what is how is air conditioning contributing to like larger production issues that we talked about earlier? Like it just creates kind of this like cycle of consumerism and privilege that actually access to green space helps to solve. You know, shade creates areas of cooling, you know, and shade available to everyone allows access to everyone. And I do think that like, you know, housing is, I think it's so interesting because I think like it is the intersection of a lot of conversations around how humans exist in and with the environment. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And climate consequences are absolutely disproportionately borne by the people furthest from economic privilege and often furthest from the cause of climate chaos. And so we're seeing that already, that, you know, the nations of the global south and developing nations tend to be harder hit, and climate consequences tend to be more immediate, more deadly than those consequences here in our industrialized nation, where we have contributed greatly to the circumstances. And when I talk to my daughters about climate change, you know, I opened our conversation by sharing how when they expressed fear to me around our future, I told them that local resilience, local systems, local networks of support was the solution. But I also offered them the caveat that we have privilege. We have economic privilege. We have racialized privilege. We are living in a place where we had a choice around where to be. We own our homes. We have freedom of speech. We have freedom to congregate. And so we are in a particular place and a particular moment and a particular demographic and economic strata where we can create a garden with our friends. And not everybody has access to the privilege and the choice that we have. It would be bypassing the reality to say, we don't have a responsibility to think bigger as well. But when I think about, you know, the risk that, for instance, a person living in a city without economic privilege, who is very likely going to be a person of color, who is very likely going to be a person dealing with physical or mental health disorders, very likely a person dealing with addiction, very likely a person who is unhoused. I mean, there are so many levels of privilege and oppression that shape who is going to be unsafe during a heat wave. The person on the street without access to shelter and who is probably of a marginalized identity is going to die first. And that is a profoundly disappointing statement on the state of our society. If we can just let people be a byproduct of our lifestyle that way.
Yes, I think that is absolutely true. And I always think that the health of a society is measured by how we treat people with the least amount of resources. And by that metric, we do really poorly in this country and also globally. And I think that that framing for me is really interesting because that person is in our community, right? Locally. So we have local authority and opportunity to better resource the people in our community with the least amount of resources. And in that way, it extends beyond our individual responsibility, right? Like that that like I am responsible for my actions, and I am responsible for my choices. I also need to provide myself with grace and other people with grace around the choices I make, given how complicated the system is and the fact that we have very little control over the industry and how the industry operates, except we can legislate on that, right? Like that's actually,
Right.
part of my conversation with David was about extended producer responsibility and the ways in which,
Absolutely.
in Europe, how kind of reconfiguring the system allows us to have different outcomes around waste, like the waste you mentioned, the fishing waste, that's contributing to the Great Garbage Patch. So there's that aspect of things, but on a local community level, beyond my individual responsibility, on a community scale, I do feel like we are all responsible for that person who is living on the street, who is going to be first impacted by a heat wave.
Absolutely. And I mean, you could trace these issues back as far as and further back than, the Enclosure Acts that were enacted by the British Parliament in the 1600s and beyond, where basically what used to be the commons, what used to be the common forest and the common fields, were basically taken and distributed among the wealthy elite. And so the fact that it is often that it's now illegal to be homeless in many jurisdictions, the fact that hostile architecture has taken root in our cities so that you can't fall asleep on a bench, or you can't, quote unquote, loiter in a public space, criminalizing lack of access, criminalizing the inability to participate economically in our society, which then also criminalizes mental health disorders and trauma, because so many of the people who are either unhoused or dealing with chronic illness or dealing with chronic behavioral health challenges are people who are suffering from trauma. There are veterans. There are people who lived through childhood abuse or neglect. There are people who have been victims of violent crime. We see a variety of contributors to why somebody may not have their, quote unquote, high functioning role in society. Mm-hmm. But because we've criminalized that condition, rather than seeing that person as a person in need of collective support, in need of community care and belonging, we've taken away any pathway towards recovery for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's also, with, talking about green space in our local city of Oak Harbor, and specifically a park that has been in the public conversation, Hal Ramaley Park. One of the factors that has kind of, I don't know, created a divide around how people feel about that park is the fact that unhoused people use it as a resting place, as a place for shade, and because it's next to a food forest that has access to free food.
Right.
And, yeah.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a city council member on that topic, and my observation was, I celebrate that a person without a home has a place where they can rest in the shade and have an apple. And if that becomes, the front porch of a hotel as opposed to a public park, you may say that it's still open to the public, but how welcome will that person feel? How welcome will that person be made to feel in that space if the use changes and it becomes something other than the public park that it is today? And, I don't celebrate that there are homeless people in our cities. I don't celebrate that there are homeless people, period. But I celebrate those people and their right to have a place in our society. And when you look at the experiments that have been done in some jurisdictions around actually resourcing people to get the help they need to get back on their feet, if you give a person who does not have shelter an apartment and some counseling and some supports to get whatever they need, whether it be healthcare, addiction counseling, job seeking training, those supports pay off, and you end up with a person who is less of a financial burden on society than if you had not paid any of their bills and had just left them to be on the streets and in the care of emergency responders. Because when a person lives on the streets, they tend to find themselves having medical emergencies, being transported by ambulance, being arrested, being put into jail, spending nights in institutions, often against their will. And those services cost taxpayer dollars. So my question for our society is, why can we not invest our taxpayer dollars in a path towards wellness and a path towards belonging and safety and long-term social participation for those people, as opposed to the penalization of that condition that we have today?
I really agree with you. And I think that this conversation, if somebody's listening, they're like, what does this have to do with the environment or ecosystem function? I would say that, every human being in our society is a part of our ecosystem. And the law and society has kind of, in black and white thinking, separated the human from the environment, human from wild spaces, human from concept of ecosystem function. But in fact, we are all integral and a part of that functioning. And so, helping people who are less resourced and unhoused to function is a part of healthy overall ecosystem functioning.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the division between civilization and the wild is, as old as the concept of race. And, it served capitalist, colonial settler innovators to say some people belong and are civilized and are part of society, and some people don't belong and are savage and are, untamed and wild, and that there's a judgment about wildness that is negative. And so that idea that you need to tame the wild and you need to civilize it and you need to somehow convert wildness into a thing that can be commodified for the benefit of society. And that commodification of nature and the commodification of labor and then the commodification of suffering, really, like the fact that we have a huge incarcerated population that basically does unpaid and underpaid labor to feed the capitalist machine, that is actually not an accident. It's not just a sad side effect of our society. It's been designed to keep our economy functioning the way it does. The fact that we have people who are addicted to substances and that we have a criminal justice system that penalizes that addiction to substances, these are natural outcomes of the system functioning as it was designed to do. And so if we want to address the fact that big business hurts the environment and that corporations are accelerating the pace of change towards the climate cliff, the instability of our biosphere to the point where it may not be livable for complex life. If we want to change those conditions, we have to change the objectification and othering of one another.
Yes.
And we have to be able to say, our neighbor is part of our solution, that taking good care of our neighbor is part of taking good care of ourselves, whether we're talking about our neighbor in apartment 3B or our neighbor on the sidewalk outside or our neighbor who is the ladybug crawling across the lawn. If we can't care for others, then ultimately we're failing to care for ourselves.
Yeah, I think seeing, caring for our neighbor and our neighbor being every living being, right, is really the challenge, which is funny because it brings out the scope of community into the right. into the whole thing, right? It like makes it's both acute and in your backyard, but that kind of brings the scope out to an existential level, right? Be like, it's actually about existence and all of our existence. And what does it mean? And how are we in relationship with each other? And I think so much of what we're talking about right now has to do with the ways in which the systems that are set up within a binary of good and bad, of acceptable and unacceptable, of civilized and wild, of, that we have this idea that it's either or, like you said earlier, which is I think is not true. It's kind of the illusion of capitalism in some ways, and the illusion that we as human beings have some type of control over all of this.
Yeah. And, it might feel like a bit of a strange segue, maybe a jarring transition, but you mentioned ADUs earlier, and I just want to tie back to that because on their surface, building an accessory dwelling unit and then, giving it or renting it at an affordable price to a person in need seems like a great idea. But when you look at the outcome from such a land use decision, the trend tends to be that communities that allow development of detached accessory dwelling units in rural areas basically functionally have their lot size double their rural density and don't do it with the systems that are necessary to support that population growth. So they don't do it with attention to whether there's a sewer system that serves that area, whether there's adequate well hookups to serve that area, whether there's a bus line and safe shoulders and egress for ambulances to serve that area. So the functional outcome of legalizing more detached ADUs is not that there are a lot of affordable rentals all of a sudden. It's that people have a building that they may or may not use for anyone's permanent housing. They may use it for an Airbnb. They may use it for, an opportunity to get more personal gain from their property ownership. And therefore, assessed values tend to go up. Therefore, the price of a lot in a rural area tends to go up. And our partners at FutureWise did some really good reporting on this issue when it was on the ballot last year. And they just really found that, and in partnership with WEAN and our founder, Steve Erickson, who also did a really good economic analysis of the impact of detached rural ADUs, they found that it basically expands economic injustice and decreases access to property in the rural area for all but the richest families. And so
that makes sense to me. It doesn't seem like a good community solution, right? It seems like an individual solution. It seems like an economic solution for people with means and privilege already.
Absolutely. Which isn't to say, I think we do need innovation in terms of sharing space. We need, I love some experiments that are being run in our community and elsewhere around, in-home suites. And we have a neighbor here on Whidbey Island who's doing good work around that issue. And attached accessory dwelling units that are functionally part of your home with a separate entrance can be a wonderful opportunity for either creating a rental space or intergenerational living. And the nice thing about an attached accessory dwelling unit is it shares a footprint, therefore it decreases the impact of things like driveways and infrastructure. And it also just very rarely creates a condition where one unit is effectively sold or leased with a long-term lease to another family.
Yes.
And so it basically negates that risk of the lot size functionally being halved by the behavior of landowners, even when the zoning calls for it to be whole. But a detached ADU allows people to behave as though it's two homes on two lots, even when the zoning says it's one.
Right, which contributes to sprawl.
Right, absolutely.
Even if technically it's because here in Island County it's one home per 5 acres in terms of residential zoning, but if you have an ADU, you basically are having that depending on where you put it. And if now based on the regulations in the Growth Management Act, that ADU could potentially be sold as a condo, now you really have functionally halved it and you are halfway on your way to rezoning. I'm curious, from your point of view, I don't know how to ask this question. What are you most excited about right now from an environmental standpoint? And what are you least excited about right now?
Well, so I think I think it's what I'm excited about, but I will say it's just what's front of mind for me right now is that we need to stop centering growth for growth's sake in terms of an economic model.
Yeah.
I am most excited about challenging what I'm least excited about, which is this idea that economic development is the be all end all of human happiness.
Yeah.
That somehow we're all going to be better off if we just keep raising the annual GDP. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that we have to start creating circular economies where we go beyond reduce, reuse, recycle to create truly sustainable economies and communities and products that we care for throughout their lifespan. And so I'm excited about challenging this idea of growth for growth's sake, but I'm also excited about welcoming growth in the sense of increasing population, because we will be experiencing population pressure. We will be receiving people who are climate refugees. You know, right now we're seeing voluntary climate migration. We're seeing people who can afford to move out of arid areas into more temperate areas. They're choosing to do so, and they're coming to communities like ours and looking to buy real estate. We're also going to start seeing an increasing pressure from involuntary climate migration, you know, people who are fleeing places that are either destabilized environmentally, where the ecosystems are no longer functional to support human health, where the aquifers and reservoirs are no longer adequate to provide drinking water or irrigation, where food systems are failing, where wildfires are rampant. So we're going to see refugees moving out of those systems. We're also going to start seeing more and more migration from political instability. And climate instability and political instability go hand in hand. You know, disasters are often framed as natural, but have man-made precipitating factors.
Yeah.
And climate instability is a man-made precipitating factor for violence and political instability. And so I just think that all of us globally need to be prepared for a degree of unrest that will change our lives. And I think that you and I are protected to some extent because we live in a place where we are close to our food. We are close to our drinking water. I know my neighbors, I know my farmers, I know where my vegetables come from. And so I have these layers of safety where instability in our food chain, for instance, will reach me later. But I think we need to be pro growth of capacity to welcome neighbors and to expand and diversify our community, but anti-growth for growth's sake. So when we talk about economic development, I don't think we should be talking about how do we increase our, how do we increase the number of dollars that flow out of this island. I think we need to talk about economic development as how do we increase the richness and the resilience and the vibrance of our local economy so that what's here stays here, feeds us, nurtures our quality of experience, and supports this community to be ready to welcome more of those people who are leaving something that's less welcoming and less appropriate and less safe.
I think building capacity to welcome our future neighbors and community resilience to be able to live well through in unstable times. I think that that's really thoughtful and makes a lot of sense. And to tie that back to the work that we do and the environment, healthy ecosystem function is central to
Absolutely
the resilience that is going to be required to survive.
Absolutely. And on a really personal level, the other thing that I'm most excited about is just knowing nature, just being with and experiencing nature. And so for me, that looks like hikes in the woods, camping with my family. It also looks like, gardening at home. And I'm really excited that, this spring I moved in with my partner and he and I have a vision of doing some gardening together here, where we can start to increase the health of the habitat here at home. We can start to bring in more native species. And really, I love gardening with sort of a habitat first approach, where I love ornamental plants. I love gardening for beauty. But for me, if it's contributing to biodiversity and sustaining native animals, native pollinators, that's going to be the most beautiful garden for me. So I'm super excited about being able to do that work together here at home.
I love that, because that kind of, brings us back to being individuals and consumers and living in this society, in this world where we may not be able to totally be, moral in our purchasing power every day, right? Like that, like, in fact, we're just making a series of compromises every time we go to the grocery store, or every time, we have to do maintenance on our cars or do anything really. We're like in this kind of compromised position, but we do have opportunities to shape the world and have agency in different ways, like, contributing to pollinator habitat in our backyards, like whatever space you have, whether it's a little porch, or if you have acreage, or if you, maybe you only have windowsills, but you can choose to plant native plants and to be a part of or be closer to the environment in that way, and interact with nature in that way, like creating habitat for bees, creating habitat for birds, creating habitat for, a variety of insects and animals, is contributing in a positive way to, your community and your neighborhood, right?
Absolutely.
Like, yeah.
And there's adequate research out there that demonstrates that, a little pocket of milkweed in an urban or suburban yard is as important for a migrating butterfly as, an entire meadow of it somewhere in a rural area. Because when a migrating species is passing through an urbanized area, if they can't find those pockets, they don't have the endurance to make it to the next sanctuary. And so, we really need to create rest stops for wildlife wherever we live. And those urban pockets of biodiversity are absolutely essential for the survival of some of our species.
I really appreciate that. It's making me think of milkweed as like the electric charging station for an electric vehicle, but for a butterfly.
Absolutely.
Like being in the middle of nowhere without a charging station is really,
right.
could really screw with your day or your ability to get home.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you think about looking down at a city, if you're a bird flying overhead, I can't remember who mentioned this to me. I was in a meeting where somebody mentioned just how important a green roof can be for a bird flying over. And if you imagine looking down at a sea of gray, a quilt of gray squares, trying to find that one isolated tree where you might land and have a rest, that is very different than flying over a city dotted with green spaces where there are parks and ponds and streams and green roofs and food forests and courtyard gardens. And a place where a bird flying overhead can just drop in and have a meal and have a rest and build a nest and raise a family if they choose to. And that's how our cities become part of the bigger ecosystem instead of a detriment to it.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. Are there any, like, in addition to kind of this, challenge, this excitement, and also this excitement to the challenge of growth for growth's sake and kind of the economic system as it exists. Are there any other big environmental questions you have at the moment, or anything that you're like kind of really either excited about or preoccupied by, or even just frustrated by? That you want to share? I mean, you don't have to, but
yeah. Well, I often think about just how interconnected all of our systems are. Like, I think about how we can't really have a functioning, healing society without supporting individuals to be healthier.
Yeah.
We can't really support individuals to be healthier without having a healthier public education system.
Yep.
I stepped up to serve on a school board because I think that the lives of children is one place where we can really shape the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so in our public schools, we have an opportunity to give kids either an experience that supports them to be creative, engaged, proactive participants in democracy,
Mm-hmm.
or an opportunity to create people who are just willing to sit down and shut up and do what they're told. And I wanted to be a part of creating the former.
Mm-hmm.
But it's pretty hard when you tug at any thread and realize it's connected to the whole sweater. And
Yeah.
I just
David
think
also mentioned the sweater.
Oh, did he? How funny. I haven't heard that episode yet. I need to listen.
Yeah.
But, I just think that maintaining a spirit of commitment and optimism, despite the breadth of our challenges, is really important. And it's important that it be done in community and in relationship, because I think whenever any of us starts to feel isolated in our work, it can feel like the whole weight of the world is on our shoulders.
Yep.
And I think far too often we get divided around issues of morality or judgment or trying to decide whose way is the best way and then judge and call out and reject anyone who's not on that path. Mm-hmm. And I just think about the example of, I mentioned fishing waste as an issue that concerns me. Mm-hmm. And I'm a plant-based eater. I'm vegan by choice. And I think that that's a way that I do well for the environment. I think that it reduces my carbon footprint and it lets me live closer to my values. But I also drive a gas-powered car and gas-powered motorcycles. And I even choose to go to the racetrack and recreationally ride my motorcycle in circles on the tarmac for 8 hours. And, there's a cost to that. And that increases my carbon footprint. And so, and I'm morally imperfect. And the fact that one of my favorite activities has a very direct carbon impact, I'm not in ignorance of that conundrum. And yet I think that if I were to reject a person because they're not vegan or because they eat meat from a factory farm, I would lose the potential to do some good work together. And if my friend who's totally human powered, who only commutes by bicycle and foot, if they were to reject me because I ride a motorcycle and drive a car, well, then they would be losing an opportunity to have a good collaborator in me. And so I think we all need to just hold each other with some grace and think about how do we collectively create better systems that give us the choices that we want in order to live in mutuality with each other and with the land, instead of calling each other out for the places where we choose differently.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think that, holding space and grace for each other and our differences and choices and recognizing that we are all doing the best that we can from whatever frame of reference we're coming from, which I do believe that. I believe people are doing the best that they can. And that's a fundamental belief I have, and that makes me maybe an optimist also, but I believe that to be true. And I've never entered a room with people where we've all been able to be open, where people weren't in some way working towards the same goal,
Right.
ultimately.
Right.
And I think that that's, from this conversation, what I gather is that we are all interconnected, and that is both the beauty and the challenge of Absolutely. Every system that we operate in, right? It's like like you said, with the sweater, if you start pulling the thread, it all comes apart. And that's true. Our interconnectedness is an opportunity, and it's why it requires all of us
to
be part of the work. And it's why it requires every system to be considered and redesigned, honestly, as we move forward, I think.
Yeah. And I think there's so much to be learned from ecosystems. Nothing goes to waste. Whatever is done gets used as food for what is to come. Everything is in relationship with everything else. There's resource sharing. There's things move in cycles. There is no quote unquote away.
Mm-hmm.
They throw things quote unquote away and they just go somewhere. They go onto a barge that gets shipped somewhere. But in nature, away means food for what's coming. And I just think we have so much to learn from the circularity of ecosystem function. And I hope that humans can find more of a place in that cycle.
Me too, Marnie. I think that would be awesome. I really appreciate you coming on and chatting, and we'll be sure to do this again in the future and continue our conversation.
And maybe you can add to the episode notes that when I ride my motorcycle in circles for 8 hours, it's actually only 20 minutes every 90 minutes because of the way the classes are grouped.
I don't know I'm not going to add it to the show notes. I'm just going to keep it in the recording.
Right on. I just don't want people to think I'm that much of a gas guzzler.
I don't think anybody thinks that, but.
Okay. Well, this has just been great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Another man up in the pulpit in the state house. Head of the table with a black pen, scratching egos, talking too loud. Externalize every outcome, every warm gun, every profit. And kneeling down to the flashing numbers, the NASDAQ, the cold constructs. Running backwards to just keep moving, just keep moving, just keep moving. Unlearning every lesson that our mothers tried to teach us.
This podcast is a production of the Whidbey Environmental Action Network and is made possible by our generous donors. Produced, edited, and mixed by me, Amanda Bullis. Special thanks to Marianne and Steve for their years of service through action, to WEAN's Executive Director Marnie Jackson and our board for their leadership. Special thanks to Whidbey musician and WEAN board member Nathaniel Talbot for letting us use his track Intuition from the album Animal, available on Bandcamp.
Knowing damn well there's a war being waged back at the workplace. Every day on your paycheck, a volume of confidence against the idea of your body being put into your own hands. So please don't hold it, please don't hold it, please don't hold it back. Unleash the power, the straight logic of compassion. What I need now ain't that old religion or the cold hard facts. Just need a woman's intuition, get us on track. Just need a woman's intuition, get us on track. Stepping out of the shadow of a false man's allegory, slowly erasing that old violence from the story, recoupling emotion, slow emotion to intelligence, granting the planters, healers, teachers, feelers a new relevance. What I need now ain't that old